The year is 1847. The case file begins not with a scream, but with the quiet scratching of a quill pen on heavy linen rag paper. It is the medical journal of a New England physician, bound in dark leather and filled with a precise, almost microscopic script. The book is an artifact of its time, a testament to an age that believed all things could be observed, recorded, and ultimately understood. On the first page, written in a steady hand, is the name of the first patient. The ink is a deep, unfaded black, but something is wrong. Around the perfectly formed letters of the captain's name, the paper seems thinner, almost translucent, as if the words themselves are consuming the page on which they rest. The journal does not record a man's sickness. It records his slow and complete erasure from the world. If these are the stories that call to you, join our community of fellow investigators by subscribing. The day began like any other in the small port town. A low mist clung to the harbor, muffling the cries of the gulls and the rhythmic creak of wooden hulls against the docks. The air carried its usual scents, a thick blend of salt and brine, of tar and damp timber, and the distant, greasy promise of whale oil. From his second-story surgery above the apothecary, Dr. Nathaniel Harlow watched the town slowly come to life. He was a man of routine and measurement. He believed in the world he could see, the world he could touch and catalog. His world was one of bone and blood, of poultices and tinctures, of ailments with Latin names and prognoses that followed a logical, observable course. Dr. Harlow was not an old man, but he carried himself with the quiet gravity of one who had seen his share of suffering. He had seen the fevers that swept through the tightly packed houses in winter. He had set the shattered bones of sailors who had fallen from icy rigging. He had delivered babies into the world and eased the old and the infirm out of it. He believed in science. He believed in order. His surgery was a reflection of this belief. Every glass bottle was polished and stoppered, its contents labeled in his immaculate hand. His scalpels and forceps lay in precise rows on a clean linen cloth. On a small, sturdy table near the window sat his prized possession, a new microscope from Germany, a brass and iron marvel that promised to unlock the secrets of the unseen world. It was a comfort to him, this instrument. It was a declaration that for every mystery, there was a lens powerful enough to reveal its truth. This morning, he was cleaning its lenses with a piece of soft chamois, a small, humanizing ritual before the day's afflictions began to arrive at his door. He found the simple, repetitive motion calming. It centered him. The bells of St. Jude's Church chimed 8 times. The sound rolled over the rooftops, a familiar, reassuring anchor in the morning air. He finished with his microscope, satisfied that it was perfect. He moved to his desk, a heavy piece of oak stained dark with time and spilled ink. He opened his journal. The page was blank, clean, waiting for the day's entries. He sharpened a new quill, the scrape of the blade against the feather, a small, sharp sound in the stillness. He was ready for the coughs, the aches, the injuries of a town that wrestled its living from the cold, unforgiving sea. He was not ready for Captain Elias Mercer. The sound of footsteps on the exterior stairs was the first indication that something was amiss. Dr. Harlow knew the sound of nearly everyone in town, the heavy, confident tread of the harbor master, the hurried clatter of a mother with a sick child, the slow, pained shuffle of the elderly. This was different. The steps were heavy, yes, the sound of large boots on wood, but they were hesitant. They stopped and started. There were long pauses, as if the man ascending were listening for something, or perhaps forgetting the simple animal act of climbing. The doctor stood and walked to the door, his brow furrowed in curiosity. When he opened it, he saw a man who was both a stranger and a landmark. Captain Elias Mercer stood on the landing, his large frame silhouetted against the gray morning sky. His name was a story in the taverns and shipyards of New England. He was the man who had steered the whaler Providence through Arctic ice. He was the man whose voice, it was said, could be heard over the scream of a nor'easter. He was a figure of strength, of unshakable confidence, a man as solid and reliable as the granite coastline itself. The man standing before Dr. Harlow was not that man. The frame was the same, broad and powerful. The face was still weathered by 100 voyages, a map of sun and sea spray. But the certainty was gone. It had been hollowed out of him. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, did not focus on the doctor. They seemed to be looking past him, through him, fixed on some distant point on the horizon that only he could see. He held his hat in his hands, two powerful, scarred hands that had once commanded rigging and men with equal ease. Now they turned the brim of the hat over and over, a nervous, uncertain gesture. Dr. Harlow invited him in. The captain moved with a strange, drifting quality, as if he were not entirely sure of the dimensions of the room. He did not fill the space with his presence, as he once had. Instead, the space seemed to shrink him, to make him smaller. He sat in the patient's chair opposite the desk, a heavy wooden thing that had held countless souls in moments of fear and pain. The captain looked out of place in it. He looked like a king deposed, sitting on a common stool. The doctor returned to his side of the desk. He took up his quill, dipped it in the inkwell, and prepared to document the case. He asked the captain what was wrong. The silence that followed was the second indication that this was no ordinary ailment. It was a deep, profound silence that stretched for many seconds. It was not the silence of a man gathering his thoughts. It was the silence of a man waiting for permission to speak. Dr. Harlow could see the captain's head was tilted, just slightly, as if he were straining to hear a whisper from across the room. When Captain Mercer finally spoke, his voice was the ghost of what it had been. It was low, a dry rasp. He told the doctor he did not feel like himself. He said the world felt distant, as if he were watching it through a thick pane of glass. He said his thoughts were not his own. They scattered like loose papers in a gust of wind. Dr. Harlow began his methodical examination. He was a man of process. He asked about the captain's last voyage. The ship's name was the Providence. The captain said the name correctly, but he paused before it, a flicker of confusion in his eyes, as if he had to pluck it from a great and confusing distance. The doctor asked for the name of his first mate, a man Mercer had sailed with for 10 years. The captain opened his mouth to answer. He stared at the doctor, his brow furrowed in a knot of effort. But nothing came. The name was simply gone. It was not forgotten in the way a man might forget a minor detail. It was absent, a clean, empty space where a name should have been. The captain's large hands tightened on his hat. He told the doctor that it was like a room in his own house that had been suddenly locked, the key nowhere to be found. Dr. Harlow made a note. Memory loss. Aphasia, perhaps. He continued his questions. He asked about the voyage home. The captain's narrative was fractured. He would speak a clear and lucid sentence, describing the color of the water or the shape of a cloud. Then he would stop, mid-word. His gaze would drift back to the window, to the gray slice of ocean visible between the rooftops. He would be gone for a long moment, lost in that strange, internal listening. Then he would return, his eyes blinking slowly, with no memory of where his sentence had been going. The doctor noticed the misplaced words. They were subtle at first. The captain was describing the work on deck, the difficult business of rendering blubber. He meant to say the work was hard. He said the work was harbor. The two words sounded similar, an easy slip of the tongue. Harlow noted it but thought little of it. Then it happened again. The captain was talking about the final week at sea. He said they were all eager to reach the shore, but the word that came out was sure. They were eager to reach the shore. The captain did not seem to notice the error. He just continued, his speech a broken chain of clear observations and strange, unsettling gaps. Dr. Harlow checked the captain's physical health. His pulse was strong and steady. His eyes, when they focused, were clear. His breathing was deep and even. There was no sign of fever, no indication of a stroke or a tumor he could detect. The affliction was not in the captain's body. It was somewhere deeper. It was in the mechanism of his thought, in the very structure of his memory. The doctor sat back in his chair, the feather of his quill casting a long, thin shadow across the page of his journal. He felt a profound sense of unease. He was a mapmaker standing at the edge of a vast, uncharted territory. His science, his books, his instruments, they offered him no guidance here. He asked the captain when this had started. He asked if there was a moment, an event, that marked the beginning of this confusion. Captain Mercer fell silent again. This time, the silence was longer. He leaned forward, his massive elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. The room was so quiet that Dr. Harlow could hear the faint hiss of the gas lamp on the wall, a sound he had never noticed before. He could hear the distant, lonely cry of a single gull. The captain finally looked up. His eyes were focused now. They were filled with a fear so pure and so deep that the doctor felt a sympathetic chill crawl up his own spine. He began to speak of a night at sea. He said it was about 3 weeks before they made port. They were in an unfamiliar stretch of the Pacific, near a small, uncharted atoll that was little more than a smudge of sand and rock on the horizon. The night was strange. There was no wind. The sea was a sheet of black glass. The sails hung limp and useless. The air was heavy, still, and unnaturally warm. The crew was quiet, unsettled by the oppressive calm. It was in this great and profound stillness that they heard it. The captain struggled for the words. He told the doctor it was not a sound he had ever heard before. It was not music. It was not the wind. It was not any sound made by man or beast. It was a single note, a long, low, resonant note that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He said it was like the sound of a giant cello string being bowed, a thrumming vibration that you felt in your teeth and in the bones of your skull before you ever registered it with your ears. It was a sound that was beneath all other sounds. The men on the deck of the Providence had stopped what they were doing. They had looked at each other, their faces pale in the moonlight. They all heard it. It rose in volume slowly, steadily, a clean and perfect tone that had no beginning and no end. It seemed to vibrate with the very structure of the ship, with the water, with the air itself. And then the captain said the thing that Dr. Harlow would write down in his journal with a hand that was not quite steady. He said that the sound was not just a sound. He said it felt like a form of attention. He said that when you heard it, you had the unshakable feeling that it could hear you back. He said that listening to it was like being seen. He said it felt as if the note were examining them, studying them, learning the shape of them. The sound had lasted for perhaps an hour. Then, as slowly and as steadily as it had arrived, it faded away into the profound silence of the windless night. The next morning, the wind returned. The ship continued its journey home. But something had been left behind in that stillness, or perhaps something had been taken. The captain fell silent. He had told his story. He sat in the chair, a great and powerful man, utterly defeated. He was no longer looking at the horizon. He was looking at the floor, at the simple wooden planks, as if they were the only solid thing left in his world. Dr. Harlow did not know what to say. He wrote in his journal. He described the captain's account. He used words like auditory hallucination, paranoia, stress-induced delusion. These were the words of his science. They were shields against a truth he was not prepared to face. They were an attempt to put a familiar name on an unfamiliar terror. But even as he wrote them, he did not believe them. He had seen the look in the captain's eyes. It was not the look of madness. It was the look of a man who had seen a ghost and knew, with absolute certainty, that the ghost had seen him too. He gave the captain a mild sedative, a tincture of valerian root and hops. It was a useless gesture, a doctor's need to do something, to offer some remedy, however small. The captain took it without a word. He stood up, his great frame seeming to cast a long shadow in the room, even in the bright morning light. He walked to the door, his steps still slow and uncertain. Before he left, he turned back. He told the doctor that the sound was not gone. He said it was just quieter now, drowned out by the noise of the world. But in the quiet moments, in the dead of night when the town was asleep, he could still hear it. A low, soft thrumming at the very edge of his hearing. He said it was getting louder. Captain Elias Mercer left the surgery. Dr. Harlow watched him from the window as he walked down the street, a large man made small by the space around him. His head tilted slightly, always listening. The doctor sat at his desk for a long time after the captain was gone. The surgery felt colder. The familiar comfort of his ordered world had been disturbed. He looked at the entry he had made in his journal. The neatly written lines, the careful observations, the clinical terminology. It all seemed terribly inadequate. He picked up his quill one last time. He dipped it in the ink. In the margin of the page, next to the captain's name, he wrote a private note. It was not a diagnosis. It was a warning, a premonition. He wrote that Captain Elias Mercer was only the first. He wrote that his name was the beginning of a list of men who had heard a sound. And he knew, with a sudden and chilling certainty that defied all his logic and all his training, that this was not a list of patients to be cured. It was a list of names to be erased. The week that followed the visit of Captain Elias Mercer was one of deceptive quiet for Dr. Nathaniel Harlow. He tried to bury the captain's strange tale under the familiar weight of his daily work. He treated a fisherman's infected hand. He delivered a healthy baby girl to the wife of a cooper. He dispensed powders for coughs and salves for rashes. He immersed himself in the predictable physical ailments of the town, finding a fragile comfort in their logic. An infection had a cause. A broken bone had a clear path to mending. These were the problems of the known world. They could be fought, they could be understood. But the captain's story was a splinter in his mind. In the quiet moments between patients, he would find himself staring out the window at the gray expanse of the sea, thinking of a windless night and an impossible sound. He reviewed his notes on Mercer. Auditory hallucination, aphasia, delusion. The words seemed hollow now, a flimsy wall of language erected against a vast and troubling mystery. He reread them over and over, as if repetition could make them true. At night, he would lie in his bed and listen to the silence of his own house. He would hear the old wood settling, the whisper of the wind under the eaves, and he would find himself straining, listening for something more, a low thrum, a distant note. The silence, which had once been a source of peace, now felt like an empty stage, waiting for an actor to appear. He began to leave a window open, letting the sounds of the street, the distant clang of a ship's bell, fill the room. The noise was a comfort. The noise was a shield. His unease was a private thing, a secret he kept from his wife and from his colleagues. He was a man of science, a man of reputation. To speak of such things, of sounds that listened back, would be to invite ridicule. He told himself it was one man's mind, broken by the immense loneliness of the sea. It was a single, tragic case. He would soon be proven right. He was not. 4 days after Mercer's visit, another man from the whaler Providence climbed the stairs to his surgery. His name was Thomas Hale, a harpooner for nearly 20 years, a man whose arms were roped with muscle and whose skin was the color of old leather. He was known for his steady hand and his sharp eye. He was a man who could stand on the pitching bow of a small boat and plant an iron in the back of a creature the size of a small house. He was the embodiment of competence. Like the captain, he entered the surgery with a hesitant, drifting gait. His eyes, which had spent decades scanning the horizon for the spout of a whale, now seemed to see nothing at all. They were unfocused, milky with an inner distraction. He sat in the patient's chair, and for a full minute, he said nothing. He simply stared at the wall, his head cocked at that same slight angle. The doctor recognized it at once, the posture of a man straining to hear a whisper. Dr. Harlow began his questions. Thomas Hale's voice, when it came, was a low murmur. He spoke of a fog in his head. He spoke of holes in his memory, like moth-eaten patches in a good wool coat. He could remember the names of all the sails on the ship, but he could not remember what he had eaten for breakfast. He could describe in perfect detail a storm they had weathered 2 months prior, but he could not recall the face of his own sister, who had seen him off at the docks. His speech was halting, pocked with long, empty pauses. The doctor noted the similarities to the captain's case with a growing sense of dread. He asked the harpooner about his health during the voyage. He asked about a specific night, a windless night, a night of unnatural calm. Thomas Hale's vacant eyes suddenly sharpened. A flicker of something primal, of pure fear, ignited in their depths. He remembered. He told the doctor that it was a night the sea went dead. He said the water was like black ink, and the sky was full of stars that looked cold and sharp, like chips of ice. And he spoke of the sound. He used different words than the captain, but the description was the same. A note. A single, pure note that grew out of the silence. He said it was so low you felt it in your feet, a vibration coming up through the deck of the ship. He told the doctor it was a clean sound, a perfect sound, and that was the most terrible thing about it. It was too perfect to be natural. It felt made. Then he added a detail that the captain had not. He told the doctor that as the sound grew, the edges of his vision had seemed to shimmer, as if he were looking at the world through heated air. He said the other men looked distorted, their outlines wavering. He said it felt as if the sound were trying to unmake the world, to shake it apart at its seams. He said it felt like the sound wanted to get inside him. Within the week, The trickle of men from the Providence became a steady, silent stream. They came to his surgery, one or two at a time. A sailmaker named Peter Jensen, a cooper named Samuel Reed, young men on their first voyage, and old hands who knew the sea better than they knew their own homes. They did not speak to each other as they waited on the stairs. They stood apart, each man lost in his own private silence, each with his head tilted in that same listening way. The shared affliction did not bring them together. It isolated them. It sealed each man in his own invisible bell jar of confusion and fear. Dr. Harlow's journal began to fill. The pages, once dedicated to the varied and unrelated ailments of a port town, now held the data of a single, spreading phenomenon. Each entry was a mirror of the last. The halting speech, the fractured memories, the misplaced words, and at the heart of each account, the same story, told in slightly different ways. The uncharted atoll, the windless night, the single, resonant note that vibrated in the bones and seemed to look back at you. They all agreed on one peculiar detail. The sound, the faint echo of it that remained in their heads, was a creature of silence. In the noisy clamor of the docks, amidst the shouting of men and the rattling of chains, it was barely a whisper. But in a quiet room, in the stillness of the night, it would begin to grow. It would swell to fill the silence, a low, persistent thrum that crowded out all other thoughts. They found themselves seeking noise as a man in a blizzard seeks shelter. They would spend hours at the blacksmith's forge, finding solace in the rhythmic crash of the hammer on the anvil. They would stand on the wharves, listening to the waves crash against the pylons, using the sound of the sea to drown out the memory of the sea. Dr. Harlow stopped sleeping. The nights became his laboratory. His wife would find him in his surgery at 3 a.m, surrounded by books, the gas lamp hissing, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He searched his medical texts, his books on neurology, his treatises on the maladies of the mind. He found nothing. There was no disease in his library that was carried on a sound. There was no illness that erased a man's name but left his body unharmed. His frustration drove him from the world of medicine to the world of mechanics. If this thing entered through the ear, he reasoned, then he must understand the ear. He began to draw. His journal, once filled with neat script, now bloomed with strange, intricate diagrams. Page after page was covered with detailed sketches of the human ear. He drew the outer shell, the canal, the delicate membrane of the eardrum. He drew the tiny interlocking bones, the hammer, the anvil, the stirrup. He became obsessed with the inner ear, the labyrinthine curves of the cochlea, a spiral shell of bone where vibration becomes nerve impulse, where the physical world is translated into the language of the mind. He drew these canals and chambers with an artist's precision, and then, with a heavy hand, he would take his quill and fill them in with thick, black ink. He would shade the entire auditory pathway from the eardrum to the brain until the drawing was a black, invasive stain on the page. It was not a scientific act. It was an act of despair. He was drawing the path of the invader. He was mapping the route of a contagion that had no physical form. He was diagramming the darkness as it filled the quiet chambers of a man's soul. The turning point came at the end of the second week. It came in the form of a boy named William Small. He was barely 19, a cabin boy on his first voyage. He had been brought to the doctor by his landlord, a portly, worried man who said the boy hadn't spoken a full sentence in days. William had been a bright, eager young man. He wrote letters home to his mother every week, filled with the wonders he had seen. He was saving his wages to buy her a small house away from the noise and grime of the waterfront. That was the boy who had left. The one who returned was a ghost. He sat in the patient's chair, small and lost. He was younger than the others, and the affliction seemed to have taken a deeper and more rapid hold. The distant, listening look was there, but it was more pronounced. He seemed to be perpetually on the verge of hearing something of immense importance. Dr. Harlow spoke to him gently. He asked him simple questions. He asked the boy what his name was. The question was a key, turning a lock that had rusted shut. William Small looked at the doctor, his mouth opened slightly. A profound confusion clouded his features. It was not the look of a man searching for a forgotten word. It was the look of a man who has been asked a question in a language he does not understand. The concept of a name, of having a unique sound that belonged to him, was gone. The file had been deleted. The page had been torn from the book. He stared at the doctor, his eyes wide with a terror so deep it had no voice. He did not know who he was. That evening, the news spread through the taverns and boarding houses along the waterfront. Someone had seen it. A fisherman mending his nets in the fading light. He said he saw the boy, William Small, walking down the main street toward the harbor. He was not stumbling, he was not weeping. He walked with a calm, steady purpose. He walked past the moored ships, past the stacks of barrels and coiled ropes. He walked to the edge of the longest pier, the one used by the deep-water vessels. And he did not stop. He walked off the edge of the pier into the cold, black water. The fisherman said there was no splash. That was the detail that haunted everyone who heard the story. The boy simply stepped from the solid world into the liquid one, and the sea accepted him without a sound. He did not struggle. He did not cry for help. He just disappeared. It was as if he were simply going home. The death was ruled a suicide, a tragic case of a young mind overwhelmed by the hardships of the sea. But Dr. Harlow knew better. He sat alone in his surgery that night, the door locked, the lamps turned down low. He looked at his notes. He looked at the long list of names from the Providence. He looked at his drawing of an ear, filled with a solid, impenetrable black. It was not suicide. It was a conclusion. It was the final symptom of an illness that did not kill the body, but hollowed it out until there was nothing left to live. The boy did not choose to walk into the sea. He was led there. He had forgotten his own name, and in that void, the sound had given him a new instruction, a final, simple command. This was the moment Dr. Nathaniel Harlow's world broke in two. The man of science, of logic and reason, was forced to accept an impossible truth. This was not an illness of the mind. It was not a fever of the body. It was a contagion, a plague carried not by air or water but by sound itself. It was a predator that used silence as its hunting ground and the human ear as its doorway. And he understood, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it had only just begun its work. It had consumed a ship. Now it would begin on the town. The death of the boy, William Small, was a stone dropped into the still pool of the town's awareness. The ripples spread slowly at first, concentric circles of rumor and unease. An accident, most people called it, a tragedy. The sea gives and the sea takes. It was an old and familiar refrain, a catechism of loss that coastal towns learned to recite from birth. They buried the idea of it under layers of practicality. They had ships to unload, sails to mend, and families to feed. There was little time for morbid speculation. But the story of the boy walking into the water without a sound lingered. It was a piece of grit in the machinery of daily life, a detail that did not fit. It was told and retold in the low-lit corners of taverns, the words whispered over mugs of ale. The sailors from the Providence heard the stories, and they said nothing. They sat at their tables, nursing their drinks, their eyes distant, their heads cocked in that now familiar listening pose. Their silence was more unnerving than any warning could have been. It was the silence of men who knew the story was true and that it was not yet over. By the end of the first month, the affliction was no longer a secret kept behind the door of Dr. Harlow's surgery. It had begun to seep out, to stain the fabric of the community. It was no longer a sickness of sailors. It had come ashore. The first signs were small, easily dismissed as quirks of aging or the strains of a hard life. A woman at the fish market, haggling for cod, suddenly stopped mid-sentence. She stared at the fishmonger, her face a mask of polite confusion, as if she had not only forgotten what she was about to say, but why she was there at all. She stood for a long moment, lost in a profound, internal silence, before turning and walking away, her basket still empty. A blacksmith, a man of 50 years who had hammered iron in his forge since he was a boy, found he could not remember the name of his own apprentice, a lad who had worked at his side for 3 years. He called him boy for a whole afternoon, his brow furrowed with a frustration he could not articulate. The apprentice, seeing the trouble in his master's eyes, said nothing. A quiet fear was beginning to grow in the town, a fear that was difficult to name because its symptoms were so subtle, so personal. It was the fear of your own mind betraying you. Dr. Harlow saw the pattern with the cold, terrible clarity of an anatomist observing a disease's progression. He knew the path the contagion would take. It moved from the sailors of the Providence to those they lived with, those they spoke to most often. It was a slow transmission, not like a cough or a fever that spread in a day. It seemed to require proximity, and more than that, it seemed to require quiet. It thrived in the intimate spaces of a home, in the shared silences between a husband and a wife. He began to receive new patients. They were no longer just the weathered men of the sea. They were women, their hands raw from lye soap and needlework. One woman, Martha Greaves, the wife of a sailmaker from the Providence, came to his surgery in a state of quiet panic. She told the doctor that she had woken up that morning and looked at the man lying beside her in bed, her husband of 20 years, and for a full minute she did not know who he was. She said his face was the face of a stranger. The recognition had returned, she explained, but it came back slowly, like a distant ship sailing into view. It was not an immediate knowing. It was a memory she had to reconstruct, piece by piece. She was terrified that one morning the ship would not appear on the horizon at all. Soon, the small, individual moments of confusion began to coalesce into a larger, more visible phenomenon. Entire households fell silent. Travelers passing through the town remarked on its strangeness. They would walk down residential streets in the evening and see through the windows families sitting together in their parlors, the lamps lit, the fire casting a warm glow. But there was no conversation. No reading aloud, no music. The father would be staring at the fire. The mother would be looking at her hands in her lap. The children would be sitting on the floor, their gazes fixed on nothing. They were not asleep. They were simply absent. They were all listening to the same silent broadcast, each trapped in a private theater of the mind. The town's natural rhythms began to break down. The noisy, chaotic energy of the port began to thin, to fade. There was less shouting on the docks. The songs of the men unloading cargo grew faint, then disappeared altogether. The laughter of children playing in the streets became a rare and startling sound. The world was growing quieter, and in that growing quiet, the affliction found more room to spread, more silence to fill. It was a feedback loop. The quiet allowed the sound to grow stronger in people's minds, and the stronger it grew, the more it silenced its hosts, creating an ever-expanding stillness for it to colonize. Father Alistair Finch, a young, scholarly priest at St. Jude's Parish, saw the creeping silence as a spiritual crisis. He believed it was a malady of the soul, a turning away from the voice of God. He saw the vacant stares, the fractured families, and he decided to fight back with the tools he knew best. He ordered the church sexton to ring the great bronze bell of St. Jude's, not just at the top of the hour for prayers, but continuously. And so, a new sound was introduced into the town, the constant, tolling peal of the church bell. From dawn until well past dusk, the bell rang. Dong, dong, dong. A steady, relentless rhythm. It rolled over the rooftops, it echoed in the narrow alleys, it carried out over the water of the harbor. At first, it was a comfort to some. It was a human sound, a powerful declaration of presence against the encroaching emptiness. It was a promise that the town was still there, still fighting. People who found their thoughts drifting would hear the bell and be pulled back for a moment, the heavy bronze tone a temporary anchor in the fog. But the bell could not ring forever. The sexton was an old man, and he could not pull the rope all day and all night. And in the moments when the bell stopped, the silence that rushed in to take its place was deeper, more profound than before. It was a hungry silence, made more noticeable by the absence of the bell's familiar voice. The remedy, it seemed, only made the disease stronger when it was withdrawn. The bell that was meant to be a shield became a frame, making the silence it was trying to fight a more prominent feature of the landscape. In the midst of this spreading stillness, Dr. Harlow became a man possessed. His surgery was no longer a place of healing. It was the headquarters of a desperate investigation. He locked himself away for hours, sometimes for days. His wife would leave meals for him outside the door, and she would find them hours later, untouched and cold. When she saw him, his eyes were bloodshot, his clothes were rumpled, and his fingers were stained with ink. He was a man waging a war on a ghost. He returned to his earliest notes. He needed to find the beginning, the first point of entry. He opened his journal to the very first page of the affliction, to the entry on Captain Elias Mercer. He read his own neat script, his careful record of the captain's symptoms, and then he saw it, a detail that made the blood run cold in his veins. A sentence he had written was no longer whole. He remembered writing it with perfect clarity. He had noted that the captain's speech was halting, as though he listens to something that lingers just beyond hearing. He remembered the satisfaction he had felt with that phrase, its precision. But that is not what the page said now. He stared at the line of ink. The sentence read as though he listens to something that beyond hearing. The words lingers just were gone. There was no smudge. There was no sign of erasure. There was just an empty space, a clean gap in the sentence. The paper in that spot was subtly, almost imperceptibly thinner, as if the words themselves had been consumed, digested by the page. He frantically turned the pages, scanning his other notes. He found more of them. Gaps, missing words, phrases reduced to fragments. A description of Thomas Hale's fear had originally read, "a flicker of pure primal fear." Now it said, "a flicker of fear." The modifiers, the words that gave the description its weight and texture, had been eaten. It was not just the minds of the sailors that were being erased. It was the record of the erasure itself. The sound was not only consuming people, it was consuming the memory of them. A new, more frantic urgency seized him. The physical evidence of his own work was dissolving before his eyes. His journal, the one solid thing he could rely on, was becoming as unreliable as the memories of his patients. It was an artifact of the very disease it was meant to describe. The final confirmation came from the harbor master's office. The harbor master, a man named Silas Croft, had been one of the first to notice the strangeness of the crew of the Providence when they returned. He was a meticulous man who kept a detailed logbook for every ship that entered and left his port. The arrival of the Providence was recorded in its proper place, the date and time noted in his precise, angular script. One evening, he went to review his entry for the Providence, cross-referencing it with the ship's own manifest. He opened his logbook to the correct page. The page was there. The date was at the top. The faint blue lines on the paper were visible, but every line below the date was blank. The ink was gone. Not smeared, not faded. Utterly and completely gone. He ran his fingers over the page. He could feel nothing. No indentation from the pressure of a quill. It was as if the entry had never been written. He stumbled out of his office, his face as pale as a sail. He went from tavern to tavern, telling anyone who would listen what he had found. He was a man who believed in the written word, in the permanence of a record. For him, a blank page where a record should be was a more terrifying sight than a ghost ship. It was a sign that the world was coming undone, that reality itself was fraying at the edges. The sound did not just make you forget, it made the world forget you ever existed. The second month of the affliction began not with a change in the town, but with a change in the doctor. The discovery of the dissolving words in his own journal had broken something in Nathaniel Harlow. His faith in the recorded word, in the sanctity of an observation committed to paper, was shattered. If the ink on the page could vanish, if the past could be unwritten, then his entire world of science and evidence was built on sand. The contagion was not just an enemy he was observing. It was an active saboteur, destroying his research as he conducted it. His role shifted from that of a clinical observer to that of a desperate archivist, trying to preserve a story that was being systematically deleted from existence. He abandoned his previous methods. The collection of symptoms from new patients had become a useless, repetitive exercise. It was like documenting the unique shapes of snowflakes in a blizzard. The sheer volume of them rendered the individual details meaningless. The pattern was clear. The progression was undeniable. What he needed now was not more observation, but experimentation. He had to move from watching the fire burn to trying to build a fire break. His surgery became a fortress. He barred the door to new patients, a decision that weighed on him heavily but felt horribly necessary. He could not help them. His office was no longer a place of healing. It was a laboratory, and he feared a potential vector for the contagion itself. He had spent weeks in close proximity to the afflicted, listening to their fractured stories, breathing the same quiet air. A terrifying new question began to haunt him. Was proximity enough? Did one need to hear the original sound, that impossible note from the sea, or could the affliction be transmitted from person to person, A second-hand echo passed in a shared silence. He began to test himself. He would sit in his chair for long periods in complete stillness and catalog his own thoughts. He monitored his own internal monologue, searching for the telltale signs of decay. He would recite lists to himself: the kings of England, the bones of the hand, the botanical names of the herbs in his apothecary. He was looking for gaps, for the hesitations that had marked the beginning of the end for the sailors of the Providence. For the first week of this new regimen, he found nothing. His mind felt clear, his memory sharp. He held on to this as a sign of hope. Perhaps he was immune. Perhaps his scientific detachment, his focus on the mechanics of the affliction rather than the terror of it, had offered him some form of protection. It was a fragile hope, and it did not last. The first slippage occurred on a Tuesday morning. He was writing in his journal, describing his new experimental protocol. He intended to write a sentence about the importance of preserving the memory of what was happening to the town. He wrote the sentence and then read it back to himself. The word on the page was not memory, it was mourning. The importance of preserving the morning. It was a simple, phonetic error, a slip of a tired mind, perhaps. He told himself that. But it was the same type of error he had documented in Captain Mercer. A word replaced by a similar sounding but contextually nonsensical one. He stared at the wrong word on the page. It seemed to mock him. He dipped his quill in the ink and carefully, angrily, scratched it out. But he could not scratch out the fear that the error had planted in his mind. A few days later, it happened again. He was writing a sentence about his scientific certainty. He intended to write, "I am sure of my methods." He read the line back. "I am sure of my methods." He felt a wave of dizziness. Sure. The word Captain Mercer had used. The word that belonged to the sea. It was as if the language of the affliction, its particular vocabulary of confusion, was beginning to infect his own. The barrier between observer and observed was dissolving. He was no longer just studying the disease. He was becoming a case study. This personal evidence of his own slow infection spurred him to a new level of desperate action. If he could not stop the contagion from entering his mind, perhaps he could block the doorway through which it entered. He turned his attention back to his anatomical drawings of the ear. The answer had to be there. The ear was the gateway. He began to fashion earplugs. He was a physician, a man of science, and he approached the task with methodical precision. He tried cotton soaked in oil, but it offered only a faint muffling of the world. He tried wads of raw wool, but they were porous and uncomfortable. He needed something dense, something impermeable. His search led him to two materials that were plentiful in the town: beeswax and whalebone. He melted the beeswax over a low flame. The sweet, earthy smell, a strange comfort in his sterile surgery. He mixed it with fine threads of cotton to give it substance. While it was still warm and pliable, he molded it into small, conical plugs, shaping them to fit the human ear canal as he understood it from his drawings. He made dozens of them, laying them out in neat rows on a silver tray. They looked like strange, amber-colored seeds. He knew he could not test them on himself. His own senses were now compromised, his judgment unreliable. He needed a subject. He chose a man named Jacob Foster, a sailmaker who had been on the Providence. Jacob was in the middle stages of the affliction. He still knew his own name and could follow simple instructions, but his conversation was a wreck of forgotten words and long, vacant silences. He spent most of his days sitting on a crate at the end of his small garden, staring at the weeds. His wife had told the doctor that at night, he would not sleep. He would just lie in the dark, perfectly still, listening. Dr. Harlow went to Jacob's small house. He explained his theory to Jacob's wife, a tired-looking woman with fear in her eyes. He told her it was an experiment, that he could promise nothing. She agreed with a desperate nod. Anything was better than the silence that was eating her husband alive. The doctor approached Jacob in the garden. He spoke to him slowly, simply. He showed him the wax plugs. He told Jacob that these might help with the noise in his head. Jacob looked at the plugs, then at the doctor, his gaze distant but without resistance. He allowed the doctor to carefully insert the wax plugs, one into each ear. The effect was immediate. Jacob Foster blinked, as if waking from a long dream. His head, which had been tilted in that perpetual listening posture, straightened. He looked around the garden, at the overgrown cabbage plants and the weathered fence, as if seeing them for the first time in weeks. He turned to Dr. Harlow, and he spoke, a full, clear sentence. He told the doctor that it was quiet. He said the buzzing was gone. It was the first victory, however small, in the war against the sound. Dr. Harlow felt a surge of triumph, a feeling so potent it almost brought him to tears. He had found a shield, a simple, physical barrier against a metaphysical foe. He instructed Jacob's wife to ensure the plugs were kept in at all times, especially during sleep. He left the house feeling a flicker of the hope he thought he had lost forever. He had found a weapon. The silence could be fought. The success, like all things in this affair, was brutally short-lived. 3 days later, Jacob's wife appeared at the surgery, her face a ruin of sleeplessness and terror. She said that for 2 nights, things had been better. Jacob had slept. He had spoken to her, his sentences still broken, but more frequent. He had even eaten a full meal. She had thought he was coming back to her. Then, on the 3rd night, she had woken up to a new sound in the room. It was a low, rhythmic humming. It took her a moment to realize where it was coming from. It was coming from her husband. Jacob was fast asleep, the wax plugs still firmly in his ears. But he was humming. It was not a tune she had ever heard. It was a simple, repetitive melody, a sequence of just a few notes, rising and falling with a perfect, metronomic rhythm. It was a sound that was both musical and deeply unnatural. She told the doctor the most chilling detail. She had leaned close to listen, her ear near his mouth. The rhythm of the humming, the cadence of the notes, it perfectly matched the rhythm of his breathing. His breath was not just moving in and out. It had been captured. It had been set to a music that no one else could hear. The sound had been blocked from entering his ears, so it had found another way in. Or perhaps it had been inside him all along, and had simply found a new way to get out. It had commandeered his own body, turning his breath into an instrument for its own quiet, alien song. The collapse of his one small success sent Dr. Harlow into a new and deeper despair. The enemy was more clever than he had imagined. It did not just invade, it adapted, it learned. It was not a static force, but a dynamic, intelligent one. He sat in his surgery that night, the door locked, the wax plugs he had made with such hope spread uselessly on his desk. He felt like a general who had built a mighty wall, only to watch the enemy flow over it like water. He picked up his journal. He had to record the failure of the experiment. He had to document the humming. It was a new symptom, a new stage of the disease. He dipped his quill and began to write. The earplugs have failed. The subject was found humming a. He stopped. He could not find the word. He wanted a word that meant unrecognizable, strange, alien, but his mind was a blank. The words were gone. He sat there, quill poised over the page, the silence of the room pressing in on him, and in that silence, for the first time, he thought he could almost hear it, a very faint, very low melody. Just a few notes, rising and falling. He quickly picked up 2 of the wax plugs from his desk and pressed them hard into his own ears. The world went blessedly, terrifyingly quiet, but the melody was still there. It was not coming from the outside. It was already in his head. The second month of the affliction began not with a change in the town, but with a change in the doctor. The discovery of the dissolving words in his own journal had broken something in Nathaniel Harlow. His faith in the recorded word, in the sanctity of an observation committed to paper, was shattered. If the ink on the page could vanish, if the past could be unwritten, then his entire world of science and evidence was built on sand. The contagion was not just an enemy he was observing. It was an active saboteur, destroying his research as he conducted it. His role shifted from that of a clinical observer to that of a desperate archivist, trying to preserve a story that was being systematically deleted from existence. He abandoned his previous methods. The collection of symptoms from new patients had become a useless, repetitive exercise. It was like documenting the unique shapes of snowflakes in a blizzard. The sheer volume of them rendered the individual details meaningless. The pattern was clear. The progression was undeniable. What he needed now was not more observation, but experimentation. He had to move from watching the fire burn to trying to build a fire break. His surgery became a fortress. He barred the door to new patients, a decision that weighed on him heavily but felt horribly necessary. He could not help them. His office was no longer a place of healing. It was a laboratory, and he feared a potential vector for the contagion itself. He had spent weeks in close proximity to the afflicted, listening to their fractured stories, breathing the same quiet air. A terrifying new question began to haunt him. Was proximity enough? Did one need to hear the original sound, that impossible note from the sea? Or could the affliction be transmitted from person to person, a second-hand echo passed in a shared silence? He had to know. The answer would determine if this was a localized tragedy or the beginning of a plague that could spread across the continent. He began to test himself. This was the most intimate and frightening phase of his investigation. He would lock the surgery door, wedge a chair under the handle, and sit at his desk for hours. He would force himself into complete stillness, creating the perfect fertile ground for the affliction, and then he would catalog his own thoughts. He monitored his own internal monologue with the detached precision of a botanist studying a strange and possibly poisonous plant. He searched for the telltale signs of decay. He would recite lists to himself, his voice a low whisper in the silent room. The kings of England, from Alfred the Great to the current Queen Victoria, the bones of the human hand, all 27 of them, from the scaphoid to the distal phalanges, the botanical names of the herbs in his apothecary, a long and rhythmic chant of Latin. He was looking for gaps, for the hesitations that had marked the beginning of the end for the sailors of the Providence. He was listening to his own mind, trying to hear the first notes of a song he did not want to learn. For the first week of this new, terrifying regimen, he found nothing. His mind felt clear, his memory sharp and accessible. The lists came easily. The names were solid things, objects he could hold and turn over in his thoughts. He held on to this as a sign of hope. Perhaps he was immune. Perhaps his scientific detachment, his focus on the mechanics of the affliction rather than the terror of it, had offered him some form of protection. He clung to this idea as a man overboard clings to a piece of driftwood. It was a fragile hope, and the sea all around him was vast and cold. It did not last. The first slippage occurred on a Tuesday morning. The sky was a low, oppressive gray. He was writing in his journal, describing his new experimental protocol. He was tired. He had not slept well in days. He intended to write a sentence about the critical importance of preserving the memory of what was happening to the town. He wrote the sentence with his usual focused script. Then, as was his new habit, he read it back to himself immediately. The word on the page was not memory. It was mourning. The sentence read, "It is of critical importance to preserve the mourning of these events." He stared at the wrong word. Mourning. It was a simple, phonetic error. A slip of a tired mind, he told himself. A common mistake. But it was the same type of error he had documented in Captain Mercer. A word replaced by a similar sounding but contextually nonsensical one. His heart began to beat a little faster. He looked at the word mourning on the page. It seemed to mock him. A cheerful, innocent word that had no place in the grimness of his sentence. It was an invader wearing a disguise. He dipped his quill in the ink and carefully, almost angrily, scratched the word out until it was an ugly black blot on the page. But he could not scratch out the fear that the error had planted in his mind. The wall of his immunity had been breached. A few days later, it happened again. The fear of the first error had made him tense, his self-monitoring now a frantic, obsessive process. He was writing a sentence about his scientific certainty, a small reassurance to himself on the page. He intended to write, "Despite these setbacks, I am sure of my methods." He read the line back. His eyes scanned the familiar shapes of his own handwriting. "I am sure of my methods." He felt a wave of dizziness, so profound he had to grip the edge of his heavy oak desk to steady himself. Sure, the word Captain Mercer had used. The word that belonged to the sea, to the boundary between the solid world and the one of mystery and depth. It was not a random error. It felt like a signature. It was as if the language of the affliction, its particular vocabulary of confusion, was beginning to infect his own. The barrier between observer and observed was dissolving. He was no longer just studying the disease. He was becoming a case study. This personal evidence of his own slow infection spurred him to a new level of desperate action. If he could not stop the contagion from entering his mind, perhaps he could block the doorway through which it entered. He turned his attention back to his anatomical drawings of the ear. The answer had to be there. The ear was the gateway. It was the port of entry. He had to blockade it. He began to fashion earplugs. He was a physician, a man of science, and he approached the task with a methodical precision that was a comfort in itself. The repetitive, physical work was an anchor. He tried cotton soaked in oil, but it offered only a faint muffling of the world. He tried wads of raw wool, but they were porous and uncomfortable. He needed something dense, something impermeable, something that could create a true and total seal against the outside world. His search led him to two materials that were plentiful in the town: pure beeswax from the local apiary, and shavings of whalebone, hard and dense as ivory. He melted the beeswax in a small pot over a low flame. The sweet, earthy smell, a scent of summer and flowers, was a strange and poignant contrast to the grimness of his task. He mixed in fine shavings of whalebone, grinding them into a powder that would give the wax substance and density. While the mixture was still warm and pliable, a thick, amber-colored paste, he molded it with his fingers. He worked carefully, shaping the material into small, conical plugs, designed to fit the human ear canal as he understood it from his detailed drawings. He made dozens of them, laying them out in neat rows on a silver medical tray. They looked like strange, organic seeds, or the larval forms of some unknown insect. He knew he could not test them on himself. His own senses were now compromised, his judgment unreliable. He needed a subject. He chose a man named Jacob Foster, a sailmaker who had been on the Providence. Jacob was in the middle stages of the affliction. He still knew his own name and could follow simple instructions, but his conversation was a wreck of forgotten words and long, vacant silences. He spent most of his days sitting on a small wooden crate at the end of his small, overgrown garden, staring at the weeds. His wife, a woman named Eleanor, had told the doctor that at night he would not sleep. He would just lie in the dark, perfectly still, his head tilted, listening. Dr. Harlow went to Jacob's small house, the silver tray of earplugs covered with a clean linen cloth. He explained his theory to Eleanor Foster, a tired-looking woman whose eyes held the twin ghosts of fear and exhaustion. He told her it was an experiment, that he could promise nothing. She agreed with a desperate nod that was close to a sob. She told him anything was better than the silence that was eating her husband alive from the inside out. The doctor approached Jacob in the garden. The sailmaker did not seem to notice him at first. He was staring at a patch of clover, his focus absolute, as if he were trying to decipher a message in the pattern of the leaves. The doctor spoke to him slowly, simply. He showed him the wax plugs. He told Jacob that these might help with the noise in his head. Jacob looked at the plugs, then at the doctor, his gaze distant but without resistance. He seemed to understand, or at least, he did not object. He allowed the doctor to carefully, gently insert the wax plugs, one into each ear, twisting them slightly to create a perfect seal. The effect was immediate, and for a moment, miraculous. Jacob Foster blinked several times, rapidly, as if waking from a long and troubling dream. His head, which had been perpetually tilted in that listening posture, straightened. He looked around the garden, at the overgrown cabbage plants and the weathered fence, and a flicker of recognition, of true presence, returned to his eyes. He turned to Dr. Harlow, and he spoke. A full, clear sentence, the first one his wife had heard in more than a week. He told the doctor that it was quiet. He said the buzzing, the low thrumming sound, was gone. It was the first victory, however small, in the war against the sound. Dr. Harlow felt a surge of triumph, a feeling so potent and so unfamiliar it almost brought him to his knees. He had found a shield, a simple, physical barrier against a metaphysical foe. He had used the tools of his trade, of the physical world, to fight back against the darkness. He instructed Eleanor to ensure the plugs were kept in at all times, especially during sleep. He left the house feeling a flicker of the hope he thought he had lost forever. He had found a weapon. The silence could be fought. The success, like all things in this affair, was brutally short-lived. 3 days later, Eleanor Foster appeared at the surgery, not knocking, but pounding on the door with her fists. The doctor opened it to find her face a ruin of sleeplessness and a new, more profound terror. She said that for 2 nights, things had been better. Jacob had slept. He had spoken to her, his sentences still broken and hesitant, but more frequent. He had even eaten a full meal. She had thought he was coming back to her. She had allowed herself to hope. Then, on the third night, she had woken up to a new sound in the room. A quiet sound. It was a low, rhythmic humming. It took her a moment in the darkness to realize where it was coming from. It was coming from her husband. Jacob was fast asleep, the wax plug still firmly in his ears, sealing him off from the world of sound. But he was humming. It was not a tune she had ever heard. It was a simple, repetitive melody, a sequence of just a few notes, rising and falling with a perfect, metronomic rhythm. It was a sound that was both musical and deeply, horribly unnatural. She told the doctor the most chilling detail. She had leaned close to listen, her ear near his mouth. The rhythm of the humming, the cadence of the notes, it perfectly matched the rhythm of his breathing. His breath was not just moving in and out, it had been captured. It had been hijacked. It had been set to a music that no one else could hear. The sound had been blocked from entering his ears, so it had found another way in. Or perhaps it had been inside him all along, dormant, and had simply found a new way to express itself. It had commandeered his own body, turning the autonomic, life-giving function of his breath into an instrument for its own quiet, alien song. The collapse of his one small success sent Dr. Harlow into a new and deeper despair. The enemy was more clever than he had imagined. It did not just invade, it adapted, it learned. It was not a static force, but a dynamic, intelligent one. He sat in his surgery that night, the door locked again, the remaining wax plugs he had made with such hope spread uselessly on his desk. He felt like a general who had built a mighty wall, only to watch the enemy change its nature and flow over it like water. He picked up his journal. His hands were trembling. He had to record the failure of the experiment. He had to document the humming. It was a new symptom, a new stage of the disease. He dipped his quill and began to write. The earplugs have failed. The subject was found humming. He stopped. He could not find the word. He wanted a word that meant unrecognizable, strange, alien. His mind, which had once been a library of precise terminology, was a blank. The words were gone. He sat there, quill poised over the page, the silence of the room pressing in on him, thicker and heavier than ever before. And in that silence, for the first time, he thought he could almost hear it. Not an echo, not a memory, something new. A very faint, very low melody, just a few notes. Rising and falling. He quickly, frantically, picked up two of the wax plugs from his desk and pressed them hard into his own ears. The world of sound went away, replaced by the rush of his own blood. It was a blessedly, terrifyingly quiet, but the melody was still there. It had not gotten quieter. It had gotten louder. It was not coming from the outside. It was already in his head. By the third month, the town was no longer dying in pieces. It was dying whole. The affliction had moved beyond being a strange malady affecting a few unfortunate souls and had become the new, silent reality. The quiet that had once been a creeping symptom was now the fundamental state of existence. The constant, desperate ringing of the church bell had ceased weeks ago. The old sexton who had pulled the rope was one of the first of the townsfolk, one of the non-sailors, to succumb completely. He was found one morning sitting on the floor of the belfry, staring at the great bronze bell, his hands still loosely holding the rope. his mind an empty room. No one had the will or the coherence to take his place. The silence that followed the cessation of the bell was absolute. It was a heavy blanket smothering the town. The marketplace, once a boisterous hub of commerce and gossip, was now a place of slow, shuffling pantomime. People moved between the stalls with a dreamlike languor. There was no haggling, no calling out of wares. A fisherman would hold up a string of mackerel. A woman would look at it, nod, and hand over a few coins. Transactions were completed with gestures and nods. The human voice, in all its complexity and warmth, was becoming a rare and precious artifact. Those who could still speak did so in low, hesitant whispers, as if afraid the sound of their own words would attract some unwanted attention. They spoke of the missing. The stories were fragmented, told in broken phrases. They would talk of families who were simply gone. They did not say they had moved away. They did not say they had died. The word they used most often was gone. One man would tell another that the Miller family on the North Road was gone. The other man would nod slowly. He would not ask where they went. He could not. The question itself was becoming difficult to formulate, and more terrifyingly, he found that if he tried to picture the faces of the Miller family, his neighbors for 10 years, he could not. They were a name, and soon, not even that. The houses of the gone stood open to the wind and the rain. Dr. Harlow, in his increasingly rare and perilous walks through the town, would see them. Doors ajar, windows shuttered or broken. He would look inside. He saw tables set for dinner, food left half-eaten on the plates, now covered in a layer of dust and mold. He saw letters on writing desks, abandoned in the middle of a sentence, the ink trailing off as if the writer had been suddenly lifted from their chair. He saw children's toys scattered on a floor, a rocking horse still gently moving in the breeze from an open door. The scenes were not of violence or panic. They were scenes of interruption, of a story that had simply stopped. The town was becoming a museum of unfinished lives. Dr. Harlow's own home, once his sanctuary, had become the most painful place in the world. His wife, a woman named Catherine, whom he had loved for her quick wit and her easy laugh, was now a stranger living in his house. The progression of her affliction had been slow, a gentle fading, which was perhaps more cruel than a sudden break. At first, it had been forgotten words, misplaced objects. He had tried to protect her, to keep her in rooms filled with noise, playing music on a small gramophone until the springs wore out. He had read to her from his books, his voice a constant shield against the silence. But the silence was not just outside, it was growing inside her. One evening, he came into the parlor. She was sitting by the window, looking out at the street. He spoke her name. She turned to him, and her expression was one of polite and distant confusion. There was no recognition in her eyes. He was just a man who had walked into her room. He tried again, saying his own name, Nathaniel. He told her he was her husband. She just looked at him with that same placid emptiness, and then her gaze drifted back to the window, her attention captured once more by the silent world outside. He sat with her for an hour, in the crushing stillness of the room. He tried to remember her laugh. He could remember the fact that she had a laugh, that it was a sound he had loved, but he could not hear it in his mind. The specific, individual sound of it was gone. He looked at her face, the familiar lines and curves, and he tried to summon a memory, a specific moment they had shared, a walk on the beach, a winter evening by the fire, the day they were married. The memories were like old photographs bleached by the sun. He knew they had happened, but the emotional core of them, the living essence, had been hollowed out. Soon, even that was too much to bear. The constant presence of her absence was a torment. He began to spend all his time in his surgery, sleeping on a small cot in the corner. He locked the door and did not leave. Days would pass. He would write in his journal, his handwriting becoming a desperate, jagged scrawl. He documented the decay of the town, the silence in the streets, the empty houses, and he documented his own decay, the words that vanished from his mind as he was trying to write them, the names he could no longer recall. He wrote that one morning he had tried to summon his wife's face to mind, and he could not. The space in his memory where her face should have been was a smooth, white, empty wall. He knew he had a wife. He knew her name was Catherine, but he could no longer see her. The sound had taken her from the world, and now it was taking her from him, erasing her from the inside out. His journal became his last tether to himself, to the man of science he had once been. It was the only place where he could try to impose order on the encroaching chaos. His entries grew longer, more rambling, a mix of clinical observation, philosophical despair, and frantic, repeated warnings to a reader who might never exist. He knew his own time was running out. The melody in his head was a constant companion now, a low, persistent hum beneath all his thoughts. Sometimes, he would find himself humming it, his own breath catching in the familiar, alien rhythm. He would catch himself and stop, a wave of cold terror washing over him. He decided he would make one last attempt at a pure, scientific record, a final piece of data. He would conduct one last interview with the first patient, the man who had started it all. He would return to the source. He would find Captain Elias Mercer. He would transcribe the captain's state, whatever it might be, and seal the record away. It was a final, defiant act of preservation against the all-consuming erasure. He wrote about this plan in his journal, in an entry penned with a hand that shook so badly the letters were almost illegible. He made a promise to the page, to himself, to whatever was left of the world. His penultimate entry. He wrote that tomorrow he would find the captain. He would record their conversation. He would ask the captain what the sound had finally taught him. He promised to transcribe the interview in full, to capture every pause, every fragmented word. It would be the capstone of his research, the final, terrible piece of evidence. The pages that follow this entry in the journal are blank. 4, 5, 6 pages of clean, white, empty paper. There is no transcription. There is no record of a final meeting. There is no explanation for what happened. The story, like the lives of the townspeople, simply stops. After those blank pages, there is one last entry, one final, partial thought from the hand of Dr. Nathaniel Harlow. The handwriting is a chaotic scrawl, the letters large and misshapen, as if drawn by a child. The quill has dug deep into the paper, in some places tearing it. It is clear that it was written in a state of extreme duress, of final, terrifying revelation. It is not a full entry. It is just one last, complete sentence. A sentence that trails off into the vast, white, silent space of the empty page. It reads, "If you are reading this and you hear it." The final surviving pages of the Journal of Dr. Nathaniel Harlow are not like the ones that came before. They are artifacts of a different kind of ending. The heavy linen rag paper is stiff and warped, clouded with the faint, milk-white residue of evaporated salt. The edges are feathered and soft, blurred by the slow, abrasive kiss of water and time. There are dark, organic stains that bloom across the pages like shadowy continents on a faded map, the telltale signs of mildew and decay. The book is no longer just a record of a tragedy. It has become a part of the tragedy itself, a physical testament to the silence and the sea that claimed its author. Most of these last pages are lost. The ink, once a deep and confident black, has been washed away, leaving only faint, ghostly traces, indecipherable gray smudges that hint at words but refuse to form them. It is impossible to know what final observations the doctor tried to record in his last hours. The story is there, but it is written in a language of water and ruin, a language that cannot be read, only witnessed. But through some accident of preservation, some quirk of how the pages were pressed together in their long, dark journey, a few fragments remain. They are islands of coherence in an ocean of decay. They are not narrative. They are not the careful, ordered thoughts of a man of science. They are the raw data of a mind at the very edge of dissolution. On one page, there is a drawing. It is a frantic, overlapping series of sketches. In the center is another anatomical rendering of the inner ear, the cochlea drawn with a trembling, uncertain hand. But this drawing is different from the ones that came before. It is not shaded with black ink. Instead, drawn beside it, and in some places, directly on top of it, are waveforms. They are not the clean, regular sine waves of a pure tone. They are jagged, complex, and asymmetrical, like the seismographic readings of a distant earthquake. The doctor was no longer trying to map the path of the sound. He was trying to draw the sound itself, to give a visual form to the predator that had hunted him in the silence. He was trying to see its shape. Beneath the chaotic collision of anatomy and physics, a sequence of strange musical notations is scrawled. It is not written on a proper staff. It is just a series of notes, floating untethered on the page. They do not seem to follow any recognizable scale or key. They are alien constellations of sound, a melody that obeys a logic from somewhere else. It is the tune of the humming, the quiet rhythmic song that Jacob Foster had breathed in his sleep, the melody that the doctor had finally heard in his own head. He had tried to transcribe it, to pin it to the page, a desperate attempt by an entomologist to mount and label the creature that was devouring him. And then there are the words. In the margins of these last ruined pages, scrawled over and over again, the same 4 words appear. They are written in different sizes, at different angles, as if the doctor were trying to find the one orientation that would make them make sense, or perhaps the one that would rob them of their power. The handwriting is sometimes tight and controlled, sometimes wild and looping, but the words are always the same. They are not a diagnosis. They are not an observation. They are a revelation, a final, terrible truth. The words are, "The silence knows you." Over and over, they repeat. The silence knows you. The silence knows you. The silence knows you. It is the central axiom of the entire affair. The sound was not just a sound, it was an awareness. And the silence was not its absence. The silence was its medium. The silence was the water it swam in. The silence was the sense organ through which it perceived the world. When the people of the town fell quiet, when they sat in their still and silent rooms, they were not hiding. They were making themselves visible. They were lighting a beacon in the dark. The silence was not empty. The silence was watching. After these fragmented, obsessive pages, there is one final, clear line. It is written at the very bottom of a stained page, the ink miraculously sharp and dark, as if penned with a final, convulsive burst of clarity. The handwriting is recognizably that of Dr. Harlow, but it is imbued with a strange, calm authority, a terrible peace that is more unsettling than the frantic scribbles that precede it. It is the closing line of his work, the summation of all he had witnessed and all he had become. It is his final entry. It reads, "Sound is not heard, it is carried." And then the record changes. The handwriting shifts abruptly. It becomes a different hand entirely. A neat, steady cursive, the writing of a careful and educated person, but one untouched by the terror that permeates the rest of the book. This new voice appears on the last surviving page of the journal, a page that seems to have been added later. This hand claims to be that of a man who found the journal. He explains that he was walking the shoreline near Narragansett, on the coast of Rhode Island, a great many miles from the doctor's forgotten port town. He says he found it sealed in a thick, green glass bottle, the kind used for preserving specimens. The bottle was wedged between two rocks, left there by a receding tide. This new narrator writes that he broke the bottle open on the rocks, curious about its contents. He found the leather-bound journal inside, damp but largely intact. He describes his fascination with the strange, haunting story he found within its pages, the tale of a town erased by a sound. His tone is that of a historian, a collector of curiosities who has stumbled upon a truly unique and disturbing artifact. His words are calm, rational, and completely sane. He is the voice of the world that went on, the world that never heard the note. His entry is brief, just a few sentences to explain the journal's provenance. He offers one last detail before the record ends, a final, chilling piece of information that reframes everything. It is a simple, factual statement, delivered with the same detached curiosity as the rest of his postscript. He writes that when he first opened the waterlogged journal, right there on the beach, under the bright and unforgiving light of the afternoon sun, he had flipped through its pages. And in that moment, when the bottle was first opened and the air of the outside world first touched the book, every single page, from the first entry on Captain Elias Mercer to the doctor's final, frantic scrawls, had been completely and utterly blank. The case file on the sound that erased people is now closed. Thank you for bearing witness with us. Join the community by subscribing, and you'll be here when we open the next one.